On May 21st, 1941, Betty Albright and her 3-year-old son, Eldridge, traveled to her mother's house in rural Woodstock, Maryland. Betty had asked her mother if she would look after her son for the afternoon so Betty could catch up on some much-needed sleep. They arrived at Betty's mother's house at about 1:30, and right away Betty went inside, handed her son to her mom, and went upstairs to take a nap. As for Eldridge and his grandmother, they went out in the backyard to play. Now, Eldridge loved going to his granny's house because she had this enormous backyard for him to play in. If you were standing on her back porch looking out, it would be 250 meters of just open grass for him to run around in, and it butted up against this huge forest. And in the middle of her property, looking straight out at the forest, there was this 3-meter gap in the trees that if you walked through it, it would bring you down to this creek bed that was seasonal, and there was very rarely any water running through it. From the porch, anyone that was standing in this creek bed, you could clearly see. And so Eldridge was allowed to play in the creek bed, so long as he didn't go right or left in the creek, which would put him out of view from anybody on the porch. And so this particular day, when Eldridge and his grandmother went outside, Eldridge wanted to go play in the creek bed. So he immediately starts running across the yard towards it, along with his grandmother's 3 dogs. As for his grandmother, she just didn't have it in her to go all the way down to the creek bed, so she decided she would just sit on the porch and read a book and keep her eye on Eldridge. She remembers watching her grandson go all the way across the yard, get to the break in the trees, and then step down into the creek bed where he began goofing around with the dogs and throwing rocks and having a good time, clearly in view. And for the next 5-10 minutes, she just stared directly at her grandson and the dogs. And at some point, she picked up the book next to her and she began reading the book and then periodically looking up to check on her grandson and then back down to the book. At about 2 p.m., she was looking down at her book when she heard her grandson yell out for help. Now, 3-year-olds yell out for help all the time. Sometimes it's a big deal, and sometimes it's not such a big deal. But oftentimes, the sound of their voice gives away how serious it is. No matter what they say, it's like their tone gives away, should I take this seriously, or is this just a kid being a 3-year-old? And she would say that the way he was yelling sounded like a real emergency. When she poked her head up, even though she had seen him, less than a minute ago playing in the gap in the trees, now she's looking and he and the dogs are gone. And so of course she's alarmed. She hops out of her seat, she goes down the steps, and she starts walking across the yard towards Eldridge. And she's yelling his name and she's walking quickly. When she got about halfway across the yard, she heard Eldridge yell out again, except this time his voice was coming from way off in the forest, way farther away from the last time he had yelled out. It gave the impression to her that he had moved a great distance from the last time he yelled to her, and it triggered something inside of her that was telling her something is terribly wrong. And she began running towards the creek bed. Still no sign of the dogs. She can't see anything. She's just running towards the creek bed. When she gets about 10 meters away from the break in the trees, she hears her grandson yell out for a 3rd time, barely audible, way off in the forest. He yells out for help, and as he's yelling, it sounds like someone has stifled him and covered his mouth mid-yell. So she runs through the break in the trees down to the creek bed where she stops, and she looks out in front of her, and it's just dense forest, and there's no Eldridge, there's no dogs, there's nothing. She looks to her right down the creek bed, and there's nothing down there, and then she looks to her left, and one of her dogs is in the creek bed, maybe 10 meters away, facing away from her, and the dog is positioned in such a way that it's clearly looking at something. And so she runs down to the dog thinking she's going to see maybe Eldridge or the other dogs, but there's nothing beyond the dog. The dog is just rooted to the spot. Its hair is raised, it's growling, and it's taking little steps back like it's been spooked at whatever it's seen or whatever it's looking at. And she just looked up and tried to look in the direction the dog was looking, but there was nothing. It was just forest. And so at this point, she felt certain that someone must have abducted Eldridge. And so she turns, she tries to pull the dog to come with her, but the dog's not budging. And so she runs back to the house to wake up Eldridge's mother. The 2 of them come back down to the creek bed. The dog is still in the same position, growling and staring in the same direction as if whatever it's looking at hasn't gone anywhere. And they look for a couple more minutes. They're yelling for Eldridge, and the grandmother is telling her daughter, look, I think he's been abducted. We gotta call the authorities. And finally she relents, and so they do manage to get the dog. They run back to the house and they call the police. Shortly thereafter, the state police showed up with this huge contingent of searchers, and they immediately went down to the creek bed where they started pushing predominantly to the left side, which is where the dog was angled, and it was also where the grandmother had heard her grandson yelling from. And very quickly, police discover some of Eldridge's footprints about 50 meters down on the left side of the creek bed. They were in some sand right at the edge, and they were walking away as if he was leaving the area he had been told to stay in, which was in that gap in the trees. But interestingly, the footprints, it looked like he had been walking for maybe 20 or 30 meters when inexplicably the prints just stop, as if he stopped in the sand where he was. But had he gone right, left, straight, turned around, had he gone in any direction, there would have been additional prints in the sand, but there wasn't, which gave the impression that was where someone must have lifted him up and kidnapped him. But they never found any prints connected to a kidnapper. For the rest of the day and that night, they would not find any more signs of Eldridge or the other two missing dogs. The next day, about 24 hours after Eldridge had gone missing, there were a number of search crews that had gone well outside of the primary search area in hopes of maybe finding one of the two lost dogs, because they thought maybe they could bring them to the lost child. And this one crew that was 4 miles away from where Eldridge had gone missing, they were walking past a swamp when one of them heard what sounded like a child whimpering, and it was coming from inside the swamp. And so immediately they turn and start walking into the swamp, which had fairly deep water, and they get to this clearing and they see there's this rocky overhang with high grass all around it, kind of forming like a cave. And they hear this whimpering again, and it's coming from underneath that rock. And they rush over and they're pulling the grass aside, and sure enough, tucked underneath this rock, inside of this kind of makeshift cave, is Eldridge. He was laying on this really well-constructed bed of leaves that looked like an animal's den. So either Eldridge had found an animal's den, or he had built himself this beautiful bed of leaves. When they approached him, he was sleeping underneath this rock, and so that whimpering sound he was making, he must have been making in his sleep. And so as they got closer to him, he woke up and he kind of sat up, and he's very groggy and confused. You know, all of his clothes were really badly torn up, and he wasn't wearing any shoes, but he overall seemed okay. He just was very confused seeming. And so they scooped him up and they brought him back to search headquarters, reunited him with his mother and his grandmother, and everyone's just so relieved that he's alive. But at the same time, people were like, how did he get 4 miles away in the middle of a swamp? And so after the doctor cleared him, saying he was okay, besides some scratches and bruises, the police, along with the mother and the grandmother, sat down with Eldridge and asked him, what happened? But unfortunately, Eldridge appeared to not know this had even happened. He didn't even know he had spent 24 hours out in the middle of the woods by himself. It was like he had blacked the whole thing out. Because Eldridge was found alive and unharmed, the police did not continue to investigate this case. And so we don't know what caused him to suddenly be yelling for help and appear to be drifting farther and farther into the woods. We don't know what the dog saw in the creek that scared it so badly. We don't know how Eldridge moved 4 miles through a dense forest over multiple swamps, only to wind up in yet another swamp inside of a cave. Although the police came out and said Eldridge must have just wandered off on his own, basically everybody involved in this case believes someone or something abducted him. It's just very fortunate he was found alive. Unfortunately, there's no clarification about what happened to the other two dogs, although the way it's worded in the story, it does sound like they were never found. In the 1950s, the Thorpe family lived in Dunbar, Pennsylvania, which was a small town of less than 1,000 people. Their house was on a very quiet street with very few neighbors anywhere near them, and their property was right up against this forest that was right in their backyard. Their daughter, 2-year-old Anna, loved to play in their backyard, but she was instructed to stay on the grass section of their backyard and not venture into the forest because the forest was snake infested. And Anna was terrified of snakes, and so she happily obliged. On May 5th, 1950, Anna was playing in her backyard in that grassy section, and her mother was in the kitchen looking out the back window into the backyard, and her mother looked down for a second when she heard her daughter scream. She looked up and Anna was gone. She immediately ran outside and she's yelling for her daughter. She's looking all around and she knows she must have gone into the forest, and she's thinking to herself, she must have been bit by a snake and she's laying on the ground somewhere. That's why I can't see her. And so she runs into the forest and she's screaming for her daughter and she's not getting any response. She's starting to panic. All her yelling has gotten the attention of her 2 older sons that were in the house, They come running outside and they join the search and they start fanning out and they're looking for Anna, and she's just gone. And so after only a few minutes of looking, Anna's mother decides she has to call the police. The police show up and they launch this massive search, and word got out to the residents of Dunbar that one of their own had gone missing, a child no less. And so virtually everyone in Dunbar showed up to be a part of the search, and they combed that whole forest behind their property, and there was just no sign of Anna. After the first 24 hours had gone by and they had not found any sign of Anna, they decided to expand the search area from a 1-mile radius to a 3-mile radius. And within just hours of this change, there was a crew that was 3 miles away from where Anna had gone missing, and they found Anna, and she was alive. She was laying under this blackberry bush. All she had on was a single shoe. Next to her was a pile of clothes. When they went up to her, she seemed okay. They picked her up and they brought her back to the search headquarters where they reunited her with her parents. A doctor looked at her and the doctor said, there's no signs that she was attacked. There's really no signs of any wear and tear on her at all. It doesn't even look like she was outside for the past 24 hours. When Anna was asked about what happened to her, she wasn't able to give any sort of meaningful answer because she's only 2 years old. But the reason this case is included in today's video is not because, she vanished mysteriously in the forest and that she was actually found 3 miles away versus 1, or, that she was found with just a shoe on. The reason it's included in today's video is because for her to have been found where she was found, the only way for her to have arrived at that spot was if she crossed 10 barbed wire fences. There was no other way for her to have gotten there. The only other way would have been a massive detour that she literally could not have covered. An adult probably couldn't have covered in the amount of time given. So this 2-year-old with no scratches on her body is found on the other side of 10 barbed wire fences. I mean, even if you take the barbed wire off of the fence, a 2-year-old climbing a large fence, that alone is kind of a Herculean task. And to do it without scratching your body, it's not possible. It's truly impossible. A May 7th article in the LA Times said the police were baffled by this 10 fence dilemma, and they said the only way it would make sense is if she had been abducted and dumped there. But the police also repeatedly said there was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted or attacked or harmed in any way. It was just where she was found did not add up. Ultimately, the police came out with a statement saying this had to have been an accident, that Anna, the 2-year-old, managed to just somehow walk her way past all these fences and was found where she was, and thank goodness she's alive. But interestingly, the police confiscated her clothing and would not give that back to the parents, indicating there was further investigation happening even though the child had been found. But unfortunately, the police never revealed whether or not they actually discovered anything else about this case. And like in the Eldridge case, Anna's parents did not press for more information about what happened to their daughter because she was found alive and unharmed. Now, Anna's case might seem like some crazy anomaly, and that's all it is. But this is not the first time something like this has happened in this small area in Pennsylvania. 2 years earlier, and less than 10 miles away from where Anna went missing, another 2-year-old, Ronald Collier, also went missing in the same stretch of woods. His mother had been sitting with him on their back porch, which overlooked the same forest, and at some point his mother had gone inside, leaving Ronald sitting on one of the seats. When she came back out again, Ronald was gone. His mother estimated that she was inside for maybe 10 or 15 seconds tops. The police and the community came out in force and they combed through the woods and they could not find any sign of Ronald. And the police got really frustrated with Ronald's parents because they felt like this is impossible. How could this child not turn up considering the timeline you've given us, which is you went inside for 10, 15 seconds and your son is now completely gone. He's completely vanished. Like, you must have something to do with this. And so the police made Ronald's parents take polygraph tests, and his parents passed all of them. The search for Ronald continued for several weeks, but unfortunately, it was ultimately terminated and they never found him. People in the area believe someone or something, maybe a bear or some other animal, was lurking in the tree line and watching Ronald. And as soon as his mother went in the house, they ran up and snatched the child and ran away with him. However, the police came out and said there was no evidence to back up that this child had been kidnapped, that what's far more likely is Ronald just got up and walked away and disappeared. However, 2 years later, when Anna's case happened, these similarities between her case and Ronald's case were just too much for locals to overlook. And so people began saying, it looks like Anna was abducted and placed where she was ultimately found inside of those woods. And so probably whoever or whatever took Anna is the same person or thing that took Ronald. But Anna was just lucky enough to survive. Although this mystery predator theory is just that, a theory, it does seem more likely than Ronald in 15 seconds getting up and running off into oblivion, never to be found again, and Anna scaling 10 barbed wire fences in a 24-hour period without a scratch on her body. Unfortunately though, we'll probably never know the truth. In September of 2004, 49-year-old Robert Springfield, along with his 2 teenage sons, left their home in Wyoming, bound for the Bighorn Mountains in Montana. They were planning to do some elk hunting on the Crow Reservation, which is the homeland of the Crow tribe, and Robert and his family were members of the Crow Reservation and therefore had the rights to hunt on that land. The specific spot the boys were going to be hunting was Black Canyon, a particularly steep and rugged area. But Robert was well equipped for this type of environment because he had previously served in the United States Marine Corps in their Special Operations Unit, which would have meant he would have received a very high level of outdoor survival training, which is perfect for living up in the mountains. Robert's sons had apparently learned a lot from him and were very competent outdoorsmen as well. They arrived at the reserve on September 19th and immediately headed out to do some bow and arrow hunting. Their plan was the 2 boys would break off from their father and head over to the edge of the canyon and attempt to drive elk down into the valley so their dad could take a shot at them. But late in the afternoon, the 2 teenage boys had not seen a single elk, and so it was getting to be time to head back to the prearranged meeting spot, and so they packed up their stuff and they headed there. The boys make it to the meeting area and their father, Robert, is not there. So they sit down and they begin to wait. And an hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, 3 hours goes by, still no sign of their dad. They can't get in touch with him. They have no cell phone service. And so they're thinking to themselves, okay, worst case scenario, he got turned around and he'll have to spend the night out in the cold. But he's got warm winter clothes on. He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine. And so as the sun was setting, the boys did finally leave to go tell authorities that their dad was, lost in Black Canyon somewhere. But it was just not registering for them that this could be life-threatening, that something really bad could have happened to their dad. He was just this Superman figure to them, and it just did not cross their mind. Authorities launch a search that night that includes the use of helicopters with thermal imagers doing low flyovers of the entirety of Black Canyon. Thermal imagers pick up a heat signature, and so anyone that is alive gives off a heat signature. And so at night, if you were flying overhead and you saw a person in the middle of a canyon where there's virtually nothing else around them, they would stand out like a bright light. But that night, the helicopters combed all over Black Canyon and they never saw Robert. However, authorities would say that, this guy, he's trained, former special operator, he probably went and found shelter. So he could be inside of a cave, or maybe he made himself a shelter with tree branches, and it's obscuring him from the thermal imager, and so we'll just have to look tomorrow. But the next day, despite bringing out hundreds of searchers and bloodhounds and people on horseback and more helicopters and planes flying overhead, there was no sign of Robert. And after several weeks of still not finding any sign of Robert, they ultimately called it off. The family was obviously crushed, but more than that, they were just dumbfounded. The idea that something bad had happened to invincible Robert, that just didn't add up for them. And so after the official search was terminated, they would continue to make trips into Black Canyon looking for their father, their husband. But unfortunately, like all the searchers, they never found any trace of him and eventually accepted that he was gone. 1 year later, in October of 2005, a hunter who didn't know anything about Robert Springfield or the fact that he had disappeared, this hunter is in Black Canyon in the same area where Robert Springfield had disappeared. And this hunter is walking through this really dense forest. He's all alone. He's an experienced hunter, and he's not on a path. He's just kind of combing through the woods, and he starts to hear what sounds like a crow screeching. And at first, it doesn't really register with him. It's only in retrospect that he recalls this sequence of events. As he kept walking on, the screeching intensified to the point where he just could not ignore it. And so he stopped and turned to listen to this screeching crow that he couldn't see through the dense forest, but he could tell it was in that general direction. This hunter said as soon as he stopped and he turned and began actively listening to this crow, he had this weird sensation that the crow was trying to actively communicate with him. It was a very strange experience. He had never had anything like it in his entire hunting career, and he spent lots of time outdoors. And so he felt like he had to go over and see what was going on with this crow. And so he starts walking towards the crow. He still can't see it. It's very thick vegetation, and he's getting closer and closer, and he gets to a place where he can just barely see this crow. It's in a clearing. There is this large tree stump right in the middle of the clearing, and this tree stump is not short. It's like 6, 7, 8 feet high in the air. It looks like this tree had broken in the middle and fallen over, and this crow is sitting on the top of this kind of gnarled stump. And the crow is just incessantly screeching. And from this hunter's perspective, he can see the crow and he's kind of staring at it. And as the hunter is looking at this crow, the crow suddenly turns and looks directly at the hunter. And it recognizes the hunter can see the crow, and the crow stops screeching and is just staring directly at the hunter. And this hunter would say he felt so unsettled by the sudden behavior of the crow, because it was almost like confirming the crow was looking for him, and now he had found him, and he stopped screeching and was looking at him. The bird continued to stare silently at the hunter, to the point where the hunter felt compelled to walk out of the vegetation into the clearing to kind of confront the crow. And so he stepped into the clearing, and the crow the whole time is not screeching anymore, just looking at the hunter. And the hunter's standing in the clearing, and he looks at the crow, and the crow suddenly looks straight down. The hunter follows the crow's gaze down to the ground, and he sees at the base of the tree is a human skull. And the hunter's so taken aback by this, he looks back up at the crow, who's looking at him again, and the whole situation is so terrifying to this hunter that he just makes a note of where he is, and he runs. As soon as the hunter got out of the woods and was back in cell phone reception, he called authorities. Authorities showed up, and he showed them on the map where he had discovered this crow and the skull next to a tree. And sure enough, the authorities make their way out, and they find the skull right under this tree. The crow at this point is gone. When they walked up to the tree stump, they discovered it was not just a human skull, it was also a human femur bone right next to the skull. And then next to that was a set of boots that had been placed right next to them, neatly next to one another. And then next to that was a belt that had been tightly wound up and placed next to the boots. And then next to that was a jacket that was not folded, but was balled up, and inside of the jacket was a wallet containing cash and Robert Springfield's ID cards. The authorities launched a search in that area to look for the rest of Robert's remains, but unfortunately they were never recovered. Also, his bow and arrows were never found. The FBI was brought into the case because foul play was suspected, and they eventually determined that Robert must have been shot. And then they later recanted that statement and said actually he was hit by a falling tree. But if he was struck by a tree, then where is the rest of him? Wouldn't it have been in that area? And then why were all of his things neatly stacked? Certainly he wouldn't have done that after getting hit by a tree, so who neatly stacked his things after he was hit? And then also, where is his bow and arrows? But despite how improbable it sounds, that is the official theory, that he was hit by a falling tree. The family, along with many other people, believe he was attacked by someone or something up in those mountains. But if he had been attacked, his sons would have heard the struggle because they were in an area where sound carried really, really well. And if a person attacked him, why didn't they take the money out of his wallet? Also, where Robert's remains had been found was very close to where his original campsite had been with his two sons on the night he had gone missing. And so it was firmly located inside of the initial search grid, meaning had he been under a tree or been left for dead by some attacker in that area, he would have been found in those first couple of weeks that they were looking before the search was terminated. So the fact that he wasn't found means either hundreds of people didn't see him, including a helicopter with thermal imager, or he wasn't there until after the search was terminated. And if so, where was he? And perhaps the weirdest aspect of this entire case is the claim by this hunter that a crow apparently lured him over to this tree stump where he found Robert's remains. If you believe this hunter's story, and many, many people do, then do you really think it's a coincidence that all of this took place on Crow Reservation, home of the Crow tribe? I think not. But will we ever know the truth about what actually happened to Robert? I don't know. On 23rd, 1963, 7-year-old Bruce Farron, along with his aunt, uncle, and cousins, began the 2-mile hike into the Uinta Mountain Range in Utah. They were headed for Pyramid Lake, where they planned to do some camping for a couple of days. After they arrived, they decided they would head down to the water to cool off. But right before they got in the water, Bruce told his aunt and uncle that he needed to use the bathroom. And so his family got into the water, and Bruce walked over to a grove of trees and bushes to relieve himself. After a couple of minutes, Bruce did not come out of the wood line, and so his aunt and uncle started yelling for him. He didn't come out again, and so the uncle walked up and walked into the trees to go find his nephew, but he was not there. And so his uncle starts yelling for his nephew, but he's nowhere to be found. And so he yelled back for his wife and his kids to come help him look. And for the next hour, they searched the entire area yelling for Bruce, but there was no sign of him. So they contacted the authorities. That day, a huge search was launched for Bruce, but just like his family, nobody could find any trace of him. The following day at 4 p.m., Bruce had still not been located. And at this point, his family is starting to lose hope. And it was around that time that a searcher who was several miles away from where Bruce had last been seen was walking up this very steep trail heading up towards this cliff. And the searcher knew this cliff was 500 feet and there was no way a child could climb up it or down it. And so he was about to turn around and go search somewhere else when he happened to look up and he saw a child walking down the trail towards him. And the child was Bruce. And Bruce was totally fine, albeit a little bit hungry. According to David Paulides, all of these search and rescue models that predict where missing people will end up after they go missing say that boys aged 7 to 9 will be found within a 7.2 mile radius 95% of the time, and that distance could be covered over a week's time. In order for Bruce to be found where he would have needed to cover 20 miles along a rugged ridgeline before scaling down that 500-foot cliff without the aid of climbing gear, and he did all that within 30 hours, a seemingly impossible task for a missing 7-year-old boy. When asked what happened, Bruce said he didn't remember. He didn't understand why or how he had gotten lost in the first place. The only things he remembered were sleeping between 2 downed logs and drinking from a waterfall and many animals, including one that was so close to him at night that it would jump over him. Bruce was followed up with as he got older, but he never could regain the memory of what actually happened to him. Some have speculated that Bruce might have been abducted when he went to the bathroom, and that's the only way he was able to cover that great of a distance in that amount of time, that his abductor basically physically moved him at least part of the way, and that perhaps his abductor was one of these animals he saw at night. In 2007, Barbara Bolic was a 55-year-old, fit, happy, healthy woman living in Montana with her husband of 14 years. In July of that year, her husband's cousin named Donna and Donna's boyfriend named Jim Rawmaker came to stay with them for a couple of days. On the evening of the 17th, Barbara offered to take the couple hiking with her the following morning at her favorite hiking spot, which was this totally unspoiled wilderness area on the border of Idaho. Barbara liked to hike a particular trail that brought her up to the Bear Creek overlook that had this incredible view down to the valley below. The couple happily agreed, but the following morning, Donna was not feeling so good, so she couldn't go on the hike. But her boyfriend, Jim, was still feeling up for it and said, I'd still like to go. And so he and Barbara wound up doing the hike on their own. At 1:30 that afternoon, Barbara's husband got a phone call from a police officer saying his wife was missing. And her husband just couldn't understand that. Barbara hiked in that area all the time, and she had been with Jim, so where could she have gone? But the police officer didn't have a great answer, and he just told him, you should come down here and hear Jim's explanation about what happened. When Barbara's husband arrived at the park, he rolled right up next to the officer and Jim. He got out, and Jim, who was in total shock, began to explain what happened. He and Barbara had made it up the trail successfully to the Bear Creek overlook. They'd stayed up there for about 30 minutes. They had a picnic, and they were enjoying the scenery. And then at the end of it, they packed up, and Barbara began walking down the very well-marked trail, and she was about 20 feet ahead of him when he decided to turn around and take one more look at the beautiful view. And he said he was looking at the view for about 40 seconds before he turned back around and Barbara was gone. And he hadn't heard her call out for help. He hadn't heard her fall. There was no sound of other people. There was no sound of other animals. There was no sound of any struggle whatsoever. It was just complete eerie silence. And as he took a few steps down the trail, he said he started looking around, expecting to just see her behind a tree or something, but she was nowhere. And as he walked, he noticed that the ground underneath every step made a lot of noise because there was lots of loose rocks and shale all over the ground. And so he stopped and he's listening really intently to see if he can hear where Barbara's gone, but he doesn't hear anything. And he's thinking, how could she have gotten away from me without me hearing the sound of her footsteps? And then he also began looking around and realized the the area they were in, this trail, it was well trafficked. And so it was not very densely forested. You could actually see a pretty good distance in all directions because there was enough space between the trees. And so he's looking around thinking there's almost nowhere to hide. And so Jim started to feel scared and just began walking down the trail, expecting to run into her at any moment. But he didn't, and he kept turning around and looking behind trees and rocks, and he's thinking, this is impossible. I should have seen her. I should see her now. Where could she have possibly gone? And so he made his way all the way down the trail, the whole time turning around and looking for her and yelling for her, but never getting any feedback from her. And he got all the way to the parking lot, and he saw her car was still parked in the parking lot. And he's looking around the parking lot. She's not out there. And he noticed a crew was working in the road. And he went up to them and he asked if they had seen her or anybody come out of that trail. And they said no. And so Jim's starting to panic, and he ran right back up the trail, all the way back up to the Bear Creek overlook, hoping that along the way he would see some indication of where she went. But again, there was nothing on the trail. He gets up to the overlook, he's looking around, he's yelling for her, nothing. And so he ran right back down again and he contacted authorities. Over the next 48 hours, a huge search was launched all around this area for Barbara. It included helicopters and huge search teams and highly trained sniffing dogs, but nothing was found. There was no signs of foul play. There was no signs of an animal attack or some sort of abduction. There was nothing. Not even her scent was found, despite the fact that the dog's handlers knew exactly where her last position was. But none of the dogs picked it up, which is highly unusual. It really was like she had vanished into thin air. At first, Jim was obviously a suspect because he was the last person to see Barbara alive, but he never changed his story despite how far-fetched it seemed, and he was very cooperative and was very quick to offer to take a polygraph test, and so the police ruled him out as a suspect. And shortly after the search started, they shut it down because there was no sign of this woman anywhere. And so unfortunately, her family had to face the awful reality of getting zero closure. She was just gone and nobody knew what happened. And unfortunately, to this day, we still don't know what happened because no trace of Barbara has ever been found. In 1910, 23-year-old Orville Tuttle worked as a locomotive engineer in Whitehall, Montana. While he loved his job and loved cars, his real passion was hunting. His friends would describe him as being a fearless hunter, a crack shot, and very cool under pressure. In October of that year, Orville, along with his younger brother and his cousin, headed off to a river valley just outside of Yellowstone National Park to do some hunting. When they got there, they made their way into the forest, they found a decent clearing, they brushed off some snow, and they set up their campsite. They stayed up for a bit around the campfire that night, but everybody went to bed early. The following morning, Orville was the first one to wake up, and while he was outside of the campsite, he noticed some elk tracks that had passed by in the night. And so he woke up his brother and cousin and told them he was going to go and track this animal for no longer than about an hour. The two men said that was fine. They knew Orville was a very accomplished outdoorsman, and so they weren't worried about him. An hour later, the brother and the cousin were now awake, and they were sitting around the fire waiting for Orville to return, but he didn't. The men waited another hour, and another hour, and another hour, and still Orville never showed up. And this whole time, the men are considering, should we go out and go looking for him? And every time they'd stand up to go begin their search, they'd say, you know what, I'm sure he's fine, we're overreacting, and they'd sit back down again. But by nightfall, when they still had not seen Orville or heard from him, the pair was starting to get really nervous. And so they decided they would go to bed, and Orville was bound to turn up in the middle of the night. Early the next morning, the two men got up, hoping to see Orville, but he had not returned. And so the two men left the forest. They got two more family members to come back with them, and then the four of them began a search for Orville. And very quickly, they found Orville's tracks leading out of the camp, meandering their way through this very thick forest and through all the snow, all the way down to this very shallow river that at its deepest point was no higher than your ankle. Orville's tracks stopped at the edge of this river and continued for 3 miles, walking away from the campsite right alongside this river until they stopped in this little clearing in the snow where there was a very small campfire set up. But the logs and the kindling in the campfire had not been burned. And so the search party figured that Orville, when he got here, must have had wet matches or something because he couldn't get the fire going. And then from the campfire, they continued to follow Orville's tracks a little bit farther down the river until they turned and walked directly into this very shallow river. And then from there, the search party looked for miles and miles and miles downstream and upstream, and they never found any tracks leaving the river, even though alongside the entire river on both sides was plenty of snow. So anybody who walked into the river and then walked out again would leave tracks. But there were no more tracks. As it started to get dark and they still had not found any sign of Orville, one of the men left the forest and contacted authorities, who launched a formal search. The sheriff's department, along with hundreds of volunteers, descended into this area where Orville got lost, and they started by searching even farther downstream and upstream of this river to see if they could find where Orville stepped out of the river, but they too couldn't find any tracks. And so for a couple of days, they searched this river and the surrounding forest, but there was just no sign of Orville. Then on the third evening of this search, one of the searchers was up in the mountains in an area that was relatively close to the last area where Orville had tracks in the snow. And the searcher saw there was a little campfire that had been set up in the middle of nowhere. He walked up to it and he saw it had been recently extinguished. It was still warm, and next to this fire was a pair of boots. But there was no person anywhere in the vicinity. And then the searcher noticed there were tracks leaving this campfire, and these tracks were made with bare feet. And so the searcher just began following these tracks. And so the searcher went up a mountain, he went down the other side, down into this deep ravine, and then he stopped because he's looking straight ahead of him, and it's another mountain going straight up, and that's where the tracks continue to go. And it's very thickly forested, and it's starting to get dark. And so he's thinking to himself, is it a good idea to just continue walking on my own? Or should I go back and get some help? And so as he's weighing out what he should do next, he catches movement out of his peripheral vision, and he kind of glances up into the mountain right ahead of him, and he sees this dark figure kind of slowly moving up the mountain quite a ways away from him. But from his perspective, even though he doesn't have a good view, it looks like a man. And so if it's a man walking up this hill, it's probably the same guy that left that campfire and therefore is leaving these barefoot tracks up this mountain. And so the searcher thinks that's gotta be Orville. Something's wrong with him. Who knows what's going on with him, but I gotta get his attention. And so the searcher yells out to this guy to try to get him to stop, but even though he was clearly in earshot, this guy just did not stop moving. He just methodically continued moving up the mountain. And so the searcher's confused at why this person wouldn't stop. And so he pulls out his pistol and fires 3 shots into the air, which is like the universal stop what you're doing and turn around. But again, this figure, this person, this guy didn't stop. They didn't react, no flinching. They just kept moving up and over the top of the mountain and out of sight. And so now the searcher's thinking to himself, what did I just see? Who is that? What were they doing out here? And he's thinking, what? It's too dark. I can't just continue up this mountain towards whoever this is. I gotta go back. And so the searcher marked where he was, turned around, and he ran back to the search party, and he told them what he had seen. And they said, okay, well, we'll go looking tomorrow. And so the next morning early, this huge search party gets to that ravine where he marked that spot. But at this point, so much snow had fallen, all the tracks of this barefoot man who was walking around the night before have all been covered up. And so despite doing a very extensive search with a lot of people in that area, they couldn't find any trace of this shoeless man. Many believe the shoeless man was Orville, and in fact, the local newspapers at the time speculated as much. But if it was Orville, why didn't he turn around when someone was yelling his name, or when multiple gunshots were fired into the air? And where was he going walking barefoot in a snowstorm in the middle of the night? Others have speculated this was not Orville, that it was some other person or some other creature lurking around the woods at night, and that perhaps they had something to do with whatever happened to Orville. But regardless of who or what that figure was, no one ever found any traces of Orville or the shoeless man ever again. So that's gonna do it, guys. Maria Gonzalez would be very relieved when her employers got back from their vacation in Europe. The 58-year-old live-in maid and all-around family companion looked up at the big house in the heart of Houston, Texas, where she had been employed for the last 5 years, ever since September of 1977. Maria's friendly brown eyes softened at the sight of the 2 little boys watching her from a downstairs window as she walked back into the mansion on Memorial Drive, carrying the morning newspaper. The paper was in English, so Maria, whose first language was Spanish, hardly gave it a glance before placing it neatly on top of the growing pile of newspapers in the home office of her employer, Houston lawyer James Campbell. Mr. Campbell and his wife Virginia had been gone almost 2 weeks now, and Maria had, as always, loved the time she had spent with the couple's 2 grandsons, 8-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Matthew. Maria and the boys had both arrived at 8901 Memorial Drive at nearly the same time. That was when Cindy, one of the Campbells' 4 daughters, had come back home to her parents following a divorce. Maria let out a sigh. Her feelings towards Cindy were a lot less warm than her feelings for the rest of the Campbell family. It had all happened 10 years ago, before Maria had joined the family, but everyone knew the story. In 1972, Cindy had run off to Colorado at the age of 17, and once she was there, she met and married a man named Michael Charles Ray. But right after her 2 boys were born, Cindy wanted out of the marriage, and her father had arranged the divorce, making sure that Cindy got full and exclusive custody of her kids. But then all Cindy had done was bring the boys back to the family home on Memorial Drive and hand them over to her parents to raise. And by the time Maria had arrived to help with the house and the boys, Michael and Matthew were both calling their grandparents Mom and Dad. And Cindy was living at her parents' expense in an apartment building that was part of the Campbells' various real estate holdings in and around Houston. And when Cindy did visit, it seemed to Maria that the second to youngest Campbell daughter was much more interested in getting money from her mom and dad than she was in spending any time with her own 2 kids. As Maria herded Michael and Matthew into the kitchen to make them a nice hot breakfast, the 3 of them chatted away in Spanish. Thanks to Maria, the boys were fluent in both Spanish and English, and now that they were getting a little older, they were also doing their best to help Maria brush up on her English skills. As Maria watched them settle down at the scuffed kitchen table to eat their scrambled eggs dotted with bright jalapeno and sweet red peppers, she had to admit that it was probably better that Cindy was not actively involved in her children's lives. From her apartment over the garage, where she'd had a bird's eye view of the Campbell household for 5 years now, it had seemed to Maria that Cindy mostly seemed to create problems for other people. During the few years that Cindy was going to the same college as her younger sister Jamie, Maria had seen Cindy get into the car with Jamie in the morning to drive to school, and as soon as Jamie had started up the car and headed down the driveway to the street, Maria had seen Cindy toss burning cigarette butts into Jamie's long hair. And not only had Cindy never gotten her own driver's license, as far as Maria knew, she'd never really had a job either, not even after she had dropped out of college and had a lot of time on her hands. There had been that time, maybe a year or a year and a half ago, when Cindy had lived with a boyfriend who had helped her eat better and even go for walks and do some exercising, and Cindy had not only lost close to 60 pounds, but she'd also told her family that she'd gotten a job at a Houston nightclub doing stand-up comedy. But, like most of Cindy's so-called fresh starts, that had not amounted to much. Because now, Cindy was back to living in squalor in her own apartment again. Maria had heard what the apartment looked like: unwashed dishes, open cans of partly eaten food, dirty sheets on an unmade bed, and it looked to Maria like Cindy had given up on exercise, along with keeping herself clean and going to work. And lately, with her parents still not due back in town for another few days, Cindy had started to drop by the mansion again, getting lifts with people Maria did not know or recognize, and who just tended to sit in their car and smoke or drop an empty soda or beer can out of the car window while they waited for Cindy to come back outside. One of the reasons the Campbells had decided to go on this vacation in the first place was to get away from Cindy. In the last 6 months, Mr. Campbell especially had gotten fed up with Cindy's tantrums and requests for money, and he had told her that it was way beyond the time that she had found a job and started supporting herself. Mrs. Campbell still found it hard to say no to Cindy, but Maria knew that even Cindy's mother had finally run out of patience, and ever since her parents had turned off the money faucet, it seemed to Maria that Cindy was always in a very bad mood. Yes, Maria thought, as she and the boys all squeezed themselves onto the worn couch in the living room to watch a little TV, Maria would be very glad when Mr. and Mrs. Campbell arrived back home. It had made Maria uneasy hearing Cindy clomping through the house. Maria was a very strong and capable woman, but she had decided that she would rather not be alone at the house when Cindy stopped by for those visits. But a few nights later, on June 9th, 1982, when Maria opened the big front door of the brick and flagstone house to welcome the Campbells back home from their vacation, The housekeeper could see immediately that just stepping over the threshold back into their own home seemed to deepen the lines of worry around Virginia Campbell's intensely blue eyes. 50 years old and 5 foot 4 inches tall, Virginia's trim frame had gotten shorter over the years because of a slight curvature of her spine and the 3 decades she'd spent as a paralegal hunched over a keyboard. Now, the top of her head barely reached her husband's shoulders. But even though she was tired from all the traveling, Virginia gave Maria a warm smile. Over the years, the two women had become friends, as well as employer and housekeeper, and they had shared a bond in their love for Michael and Matthew. Maria appreciated Virginia's sense of humor, and she liked that her employer did not show off her wealth with expensive and fussy furniture. Despite its size, the inside of the Campbell's house was comfortable and plain. Mr. Campbell sometimes accepted TVs and other appliances in place of payment from his clients, and inside the living room there were 2 TVs, one stacked on top of the other. There wasn't very much that was fancy about Virginia either. She was a hard worker, she enjoyed wearing inexpensive costume jewelry, and if Maria could find one fault with her employer, it was that Virginia was maybe overly generous with everybody and maybe a little too timid when it came to speaking her mind. The same could never be said of Mr. Campbell. 6 foot 4 inches tall, 201 pounds with a strong build and dark hair and features, James Campbell, who was 55 years old, had made a name for himself as a highly skilled and successful Houston lawyer with a solo practice and a sly and unpredictable sense of humor. He was well known not just for winning cases, but for his courtroom theatrics. With his trademark Panama hat with its wide brim and his slightly rumpled suits, he was delighted when lawyers for insurance companies underestimated his ability to collect money on behalf of his clients for physical or mental or emotional injuries. He was also a devoted husband and family man. He and Virginia had met when they were both in college in Los Angeles, California, and they had been together ever since. James regularly fired difficult clients and refused huge cases that would take up too much of his time. The Campbells seldom drank or entertained, although they did have a circle of close friends that they liked to spend time with. James's only exercise was playing golf, and most of the time that he was out on the green, he was chewing one of his favorite brands of cigars. Now, even though the couple worked together in James's law office, both James and Virginia were thinking about retirement. In the last year, Virginia had had a health scare. She discovered a lump in her breast, and even though it turned out not to be cancer, it had reminded her and James that there was more to life than just the practice of the law. And even though the couple had done well for themselves financially, if they were going to retire, then they wanted to cut back on unnecessary expenditures, like continuing to support their 27-year-old daughter, Cindy. So, while their vacation was a welcome break for James and Virginia, it hadn't really done anything to solve the family's Cindy problem or change the resentment Cindy was feeling about her parents' decision to finally push her out of the nest. One look at Virginia's tired face, and Maria decided not to even mention Cindy's recent visit to the house while her parents were away. But Cindy herself had no intention of protecting her mother from worry. Instead, she seemed eager to make sure that her mother was as miserable as possible. 2 days after the Campbells had returned from their vacation, and while James was at his law office, Cindy had arrived at the mansion on Memorial Drive and yelled and screamed at her mother, demanding more money. By that afternoon, Cindy not only had more money, she was dragging her mother around Houston to buy Cindy expensive silk blouses and designer jeans. The next day, June 12th, Michael and Matthew were waiting for Maria when she came into the main house first thing in the morning. The boys cried when they told Maria about the big fight late the night before between Virginia, who they called Mom, and their biological mother, who they just called Cindy, that had occurred when Virginia gave Cindy a ride back to her apartment with all her shopping bags full of new clothes. Maria calmed the boys down as best as she could, but it was clear to Maria that Virginia Campbell was just too timid to stick up for herself. Maria wished that the other Campbell daughters lived closer so they could come by and visit and make Mr. and Mrs. Campbell and the boys smile again. On June 17th, the Campbells' youngest daughter, Jamie, who had left Houston to attend a college out in Knoxville, Tennessee, called to check in on her mom. Now that it was spring, Jamie was hoping to plan a long vacation back at home in Houston. But when Jamie mentioned this plan to her mother on the phone, Virginia just changed the subject. And more, Jamie had the feeling that her parents just wanted her to stay right where she was in Knoxville rather than come back to the family home. The next day, Friday, June 18th, was hot and humid. But the spring flowers were in bloom, and the Campbells, including Maria, were all looking forward to an evening out at Houston's Memorial City Mall. And while Virginia did look delighted as she and Maria and Matthew strolled from shop to shop, with Virginia buying small gifts for each of them, when the three of them sat down in the mall cafeteria for a bite to eat, Virginia seemed so anxious and worried that she had no appetite for food. Instead, Virginia just lit one cigarette after another, stubbing each one out after only a few puffs, before ordering a Coke and then coffee. By the time they got home, around 9 p.m. that evening, James and his older grandson, Michael, had already returned from their evening out, and now James had stretched out his long legs in the living room and was watching TV. Watching as Virginia joined her husband, Maria smiled before walking upstairs to check on the two boys and get them settled for bed. Friday nights were a special treat for Michael and Matthew. That was the one night of the week when they were allowed to drag their sleeping bags and bedding into their grandparents' master bedroom for a sleepover. That involved arranging themselves at the foot of their grandparents' bed and watching a movie on a cassette tape before falling asleep. Maria glanced at her watch. It was almost 9:30 p.m. She helped the boys get comfortable in their sleeping bags at the foot of the bed, and as she kissed them goodnight, she told them that their grandfather would be up any minute to start the movie. A few minutes later, after stopping by the living room to say goodnight to James and Virginia, Maria made her way out the back door to her own apartment over the garage. As she climbed the wooden stairs and looked up at the big Texas sky, Maria shook her head, wishing there was more she could do to help Mrs. Campbell. At about 3:40 a.m. on June 19th, less than 6 hours after Maria had left the main house to return to her apartment, Maria was startled awake by the sound of small footsteps running up her outside stairs, and then the sound of small hands banging on her door. A moment later, Maria heard the frantic and terrified wails of Michael and Matthew as they begged her to let them inside. After stumbling out of her bedroom and opening the door, it took Maria another moment to understand what Michael and Matthew were telling her. As she leaned down to gather the boys into her arms, the oldest pulled on her nightgown and looked up at her, tears running down his face. And now he was practically screaming as he told Maria in Spanish that Mom and Dad, aka James and Virginia, were dead. "They just killed them! They just killed them!" the little boy kept repeating. And then, "Maria, please, call the hospital, call an ambulance!" At first, Maria believed the boys, both of them, had just had a terrible nightmare, but even as she offered to make them some sugar water and sit down at the table with them, Maria saw that the boys had wet their pants. This was no bad dream, they told her. This had happened. The boys had been asleep, and then the light came on, and then there were loud noises, and then it was quiet again. And when Michael had finally crawled out of his sleeping bag, climbed to his feet, and looked onto the bed, he had seen that his grandparents, Mom and Dad, were covered in red, and they were no longer moving. Maria still could not believe it, and she didn't know enough English to tell this fantastical story to the police. So instead of calling 911, Maria told Michael to call his uncle J.W. Campbell, James Campbell's older brother, who was also a lawyer. 20 minutes later, J.W. and his wife Brucine arrived at 8901 Memorial Drive. While J.W. waited in Maria's apartment with the two boys, Brucine and Maria made their way over to the back entrance of the main house and stepped inside through the unlocked kitchen door. A minute later, and the two women were standing in the doorway of the master bedroom, and Michael and Matthew had been right. James and Virginia Campbell were dead. By 4:13 a.m., just half an hour after Maria had come suddenly awake, Houston police and medical personnel had arrived on the scene. Two men in uniform told the small group of 3 adults and 2 children, who were now huddled in the driveway, to step way back from the house. And Maria and Brucine felt a bolt of fear as they understood what the officers were really saying to them, that the killer might still be in the house. Detectives Michael St. John and his senior partner Carl Kent got the call at 4:35 a.m. a big murder out on Memorial Drive in an especially affluent area of Houston known as the Golden Buckle on the Sun Belt. 20 minutes later, the two homicide detectives had arrived at the Campbell home and were met in the back of the house by an officer who told them that police had searched the house and it was empty except for the two victims. Stepping into the downstairs rooms, Detective Kent was surprised at how plain the inside of the house was, but when he stepped into the master bedroom, any thoughts about home decor just vanished, as his mind went blank with shock. As a veteran homicide detective, Carl Kent had seen his share of gruesome murders, but this was his first cold-blooded execution. And the fact that the bodies in front of him were inside one of the safest and richest neighborhoods in Texas made him feel like he was looking at an overdone and grotesque movie set rather than real life. Everywhere he looked, there was blood. It was spattered on the ceiling, it was dripping down the walls and pictures, it was sprayed onto the curtains, and it was soaking into the sheets and mattress where James lay on his back and Virginia lay on her side. 2 tan sleeping bags lay in a heap on the floor at the foot of the bed. Detective Kent wondered if the killer had even realized that the Campbells' grandsons and potential witnesses were lying right at the shooter's feet when the shots were fired. Detective Kent left his junior partner and the crime scene techs to do their work. He had already noticed some spent shell casings in the bedroom and a plastic surgical glove in the living room that the killer may have dropped on their way out of the house. But right now, Detective Kent wanted to talk to his first person of interest, James Campbell's brother, J.W., the man Maria had told Michael to call even before calling police. The detective wanted to know why J.W., an able-bodied man, had sent Maria and Brucine into the house to check out a possible murder scene instead of going into the house himself, and why, after getting Michael's frantic call, J.W. hadn't immediately alerted the police before heading over to the Campbell's residence. And when Detective Kent eventually spoke to the Campbell's grandsons about what they had seen, the oldest said what his uncle J.W. had told him to say: "I have a right to remain silent." The detective couldn't help but wonder if J.W. had anything he was trying to hide. By late Saturday, 3 of the Campbell daughters had arrived in Houston and were gathered at Memorial Drive. As the women, the oldest, Michelle, and the youngest, Jamie, followed by the second oldest, Betty, started going through their parents' house to see if anything was missing, they quickly discovered that the police were wrong when they assumed there had been no sign of robbery. While no one had taken the gold watch and diamond ring that Virginia had been wearing, and there was no sign that the house had been ransacked, the daughters and Maria quickly discovered that the fat roll of $100 bills that Virginia had taken with her the previous day on her trip to the mall was missing. The fourth Campbell daughter, Cindy, did not show up at 8901 Memorial Drive until the following afternoon, Sunday, June 20th, a day and a half after she'd been told that her parents were dead. And when Cindy did arrive, she and the man driving her, David West, who was yet another one of her on-again, off-again boyfriends, both looked totally hungover. Investigators had already tracked down Cindy and interviewed both her and David. While police were still checking out their alibis, they both seemed pretty solid. David had driven Cindy to her parents' house at about 10 p.m. on the night of June 18th to get some money from her mom, and David had waited in the car. After that, Cindy and David spent the night going out to eat, then attending 2 different parties where they were seen by multiple witnesses before ending the night at David's house well past the time when the Campbells were murdered. And even though Detective Kent and other investigators would hear plenty of stories about the fights Cindy had with her parents over money, police could find nothing in her background or David's to suggest that they could be tied to the murder. As for the other sisters and James's brother, J.W. Campbell, it would turn out that all of them too had solid alibis. And that was the problem. From the very start of the investigation, detectives were hampered by the lack of any useful physical evidence they had collected from the crime scene. They had discovered shell casings along with silver-tipped bullets, a kind of ammunition favored by professional shooters, but there was no murder weapon. They had discovered the point of entry into the Campbell's house, a downstairs den window that had been left unlocked, and in front of the window, a sofa that Maria told them had been pushed out of its usual place under the window. Outside the window, they found footprints that looked like they belonged to a pair of men's boots, along with a few cigarette butts, and inside the house, they had found that single blue surgical glove that the killer must have dropped on their way out of the house. Today, crime techs would have been able to run DNA tests on the cigarette butts and inside of the surgical glove, but back in 1982, the only forensic tool police had were fingerprint tests, and the killer, who appeared to have worn gloves during the attack, had not left any prints at the scene. But even without any solid leads, police continued the slow process of investigating every other clue they could find. They interviewed James Campbell's clients and anyone else whose name came up as someone James had crossed in a court case. They also tracked down Cindy's ex-husband and the father of her children, Michael and Matthew, but it turned out that in addition to having an alibi himself, the boys' biological father had no interest in getting custody of the boys. The same was true of Cindy. On June 23rd, the day after her parents' funeral, Cindy had arrived at the house to take Michael and Matthew home with her. Over the objections of both Maria and the children and her sisters, Cindy had marched out with Michael and Matthew. But less than a week later, she had given up completely on parenthood. Police got a call from the DePelchin Children's Center and Adoption Agency saying that Cindy Campbell had just turned her two young boys over to the center. After police went to the orphanage and retrieved the children, the Campbells decided that the safest place now for Matthew and Michael was to stay in the care of their uncle, J.W., a lawyer, and his wife, Brucine. Over the next 4 months, the Houston police racked up so much overtime investigating the Campbell murder that they could only put in for half of it and still expect to get paid. They followed up on tips that the mafia might be involved. They followed tips from a prison inmate bragging about slitting the throats of some rich couple in Houston. And because Cindy's three sisters had zeroed in on Cindy as their prime suspect, the police did spot surveillance checks on Cindy and on David, even though the couple seemed to have broken up and gone their own separate ways. But even as the investigation slowly sputtered to a halt, the family drama among the Campbell sisters was just swinging into high gear. Cindy wanted her parents' house sold and the estate settled right away so she could get her share of her parents' money. But it turned out that most of the Campbells' wealth was tied up in real estate, not cash or stocks or bonds, and Cindy's sisters wanted to hold off on selling the house or other real estate holdings until the market improved and they could get a better price. And while investigators were eager for any new evidence, the frequent calls they were now getting from Betty and Jamie insisting that their sister, Cindy, had to be guilty of something had started to sound more and more unreliable, like detectives were just hearing the same old lines from a long-running and distorted family argument. By the end of October 1982, almost 5 months after James and Virginia were shot in their own bedroom, investigators quietly shelved the Campbell murder case. There were a lot of other homicides in the huge city of Houston that were just as important and a lot easier to solve. It wouldn't be until February 1985, more than 2 years after the murder of James and Virginia Campbell, that investigators would finally get the tip they were hoping for. And when that call came in, the story police heard was so unbelievable that not only would it make detectives yank that cold case right off the shelf, it would also put the Campbell homicide case onto the front pages of national newspapers from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, California. Based on that big tip and follow-up work by police, here is a reconstruction of what really happened in the early morning hours of June 19, 1982, at the Big Brick House on 8901 Memorial Drive in one of Houston's most affluent neighborhoods. At 2:30 a.m. on Saturday, June 18th, the Campbell's killer cleaned the .45 caliber pistol one more time before sliding the magazine of silver-tipped bullets inside. By 3 a.m., the killer had inspected the rest of the gear, smeared mud on the license plate of the car they'd be driving so no one could read all the numbers, and slipped on a tight-fitting pair of plastic surgical gloves. Then the killer slid behind the car's steering wheel and eased out onto the main road that led west to Memorial Drive and the Campbell house. As the killer neared the Campbell street, they turned off their headlights and pulled their car onto the shoulder of the road on the opposite side of the hulking brick and stone house with the red tile roof. The time was 3:20 a.m. The .45 was tucked into the killer's shoulder holster, and a white hockey mask that goalies wore to protect their entire face fit snugly over the black ski mask underneath. Crossing the road to the front gate that blocked the entrance to the Campbell's property, the killer, careful not to make any noise, unwound a heavy metal chain that was wrapped, but not locked, around the latch. Stepping to the rear wall of the house, the killer found the window that looked in on the den. After easing the screen out, they began to work the window until it slid up just far enough that the killer could slip inside the house. A moment later, after pushing aside a sofa that had been under the window, the killer had crossed the den and then the living room, headed for the curved stairway to the second floor. Before placing their boots soundlessly on the first tread, the killer gently released the safety on the .45 caliber pistol in the shoulder holster. At the landing, the killer paused to listen. The big house was quiet. Turning to the upstairs hallway that was faintly lit by a nightlight plugged into an electrical outlet in the woodwork, the killer went up the last few steps to the second floor. Ignoring the closed doors on either side of the hallway ahead, the killer stopped at the first door on the right. They reached out a gloved hand and slowly turned the knob, pushing the door to the master bedroom open just an inch at a time. Stepping into the room, the killer saw that the queen-sized bed was positioned so the headboard was to the killer's right. The killer could just make out the figures of James and Virginia Campbell asleep on top of the covers. The killer slipped their hand upwards along the inside wall to the light switch. Taking a slow and steady breath, they flipped on the light and then took 2 steps forward towards the end of the bed. James rolled over onto his right side and started to bring his left arm up towards his face. The first bullet hit him in the neck. The killer immediately shifted their sights and aimed at Virginia. As the killer pulled the trigger again, Virginia moved slightly, and the first bullet grazed her upper arm. Quickly, the killer moved their weapon back to the man, and the third round struck James Campbell in his left eye. The fourth shot hit Virginia in her head. Stepping closer to the bed, the killer fired 2 more rounds, one into each of the victims' chests. Breathing hard, the killer took in the spray of blood across the headboard wall and ceiling. Then the killer looked down one more time to make sure that the Campbells were dead. All of 12 seconds had passed since the killer had switched on the light. Turning, the killer ran out of the room, down the curved stairway, through the living room, and out onto the front yard. The killer had never even noticed that upstairs in the master bedroom, inside of the heap of bedding at the foot of the bed, lay 2 small boys. 20 or 30 feet from the house, the killer suddenly stopped. Looking around and then swearing softly to themselves, the killer turned and went back to the house. The killer saw her at once, crouched on the living room floor in the dark, patting her hands over the rug, looking for the blue surgical glove she had dropped. Even without her black ski mask on, with her hair tucked inside of the man's hat and dressed in a man's coat and boots, it would have been hard for anyone to recognize the figure as Cindy Campbell. Sweating under the hockey mask and his hooded field jacket, David West grabbed Cindy's arm and pulled her to her feet. "Come on," he told her, "let's go." A few seconds later, they were both back inside of the car to Buffalo Bayou, a marshy body of water in Houston where they would get rid of everything that could connect them to the murders they had just committed. The plot to kill James and Virginia Campbell started to take form 2 years earlier, back in the fall of 1980. That's when a 22-year-old ex-Marine named David Duval West first met Cindy Campbell. The meeting happened totally by chance at the Student Center at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where Cindy and her younger sister Jamie were both students. David was not a student, but he sometimes came to the Crooker Student Center to eat lunch. The 2 sisters were sitting there together one fall afternoon when David walked in and, recognizing Jamie as a girl he had once dated, walked over to their table to say hello. When Jamie introduced David to her older sister, Cindy, at first, David was repelled by Cindy's physical appearance. David only liked women who were slim and attractive in a very conventional way. At 5 foot 4 inches tall and weighing 180 pounds, Cindy, with her stringy brown hair and round face, could hardly have been further from David's ideal. except that David found himself noticing how long Cindy's eyelashes were and how her hazel eyes had an exotic tilt to them. And the second time he bumped into Cindy a few weeks later, he stopped again to talk. And this time he told her that she could actually be very attractive if she just lost a little weight and tried a little harder with her appearance. A few days later, David got a call from Cindy. She asked David out on a date, and David said yes. When Cindy hung up the phone, she turned to her sister, Jamie, who was sitting in the same room with her at 8901 Memorial Drive, and Cindy said this about David, quote, "He's really gross, he looks like a pig, but you know what? He'd be easy to train," end quote. And it would turn out that Cindy was right. David was very easy to train. By the spring of 1981, Cindy had dropped out of college and had been living with David for 6 months. He'd put her on a diet and prescribed a regular regimen of exercise, and Cindy had lost 50 pounds. She still wasn't interested in getting a job, but David was so proud of how successfully he was managing Cindy's weight and appearance that he didn't mind supporting her. And now, everywhere they went, men admired Cindy. And Cindy had decided to take a gig as a stand-up comic at the bar where David worked as a bartender. But even as David congratulated himself on having created his own perfect woman, Cindy was busy drawing David into a tangled web of lies. According to Cindy, she had been relentlessly and continually abused ever since she was a child by her parents, by her sisters, by her first husband, and by every boyfriend she had ever had. She had been hit, pinched, tripped, beaten, cut, neglected, and humiliated in every way imaginable. But according to Cindy, the worst thing that had ever happened to her was getting sexually molested by her father. For weeks and then months, Cindy talked non-stop to David about the abuse she had suffered until finally David agreed with Cindy that both her parents were such horrible human beings that they deserved to die. And when they did die, Cindy, who had been supported by James and Virginia her whole life, would no longer have to ask for money. Instead, her parents' money would simply become her money in the form of her inheritance. What David had no way of knowing was that Cindy told any person she became close to about being horribly abused. But depending on her audience, the type of abuse and the names of the abusers would change. As for her charge that her father had committed incest, she was just as likely to tell people that she herself was illegitimate and that James wasn't her father at all. Sometimes it was Michael James was supposed to have fathered, other times it was Matthew, and other times the father of both sons was her no-good ex-husband Michael Ray. The point of Cindy's stories, none of which police were ever able to substantiate, seemed to be so she could manipulate people and play on their sympathy to get money, and persuade them to take care of her and feed her and invite her into their homes. Even after Cindy left David and moved on to other boyfriends, she always popped into David's life either to rekindle their sexual relationship or ask for some kind of help, and each time she made sure she reminded him about what she claimed her father had done to her. And by early spring 1982, when James and Virginia decided it was time for their daughter Cindy to go get a job, Cindy returned to David, and when she did, it was to tell him that suddenly her father had started making inappropriate advances towards her, and Cindy wanted David to kill both James and Virginia Campbell. So, while James and Virginia began planning their trip to Europe with a return date of June 9th, David and Cindy began to plan exactly how they were going to kill them. And by the evening of June 19th, David and Cindy were ready to put their plan into action. Weeks earlier, David had picked up a Combat Commander .45 caliber pistol from one of his friends, and he'd been going to a local shooting range to brush up on the marksmanship skills he had learned in the Marines. He'd also bought jackets, coats, ski masks, and boots for himself and Cindy, so even if anyone saw them, no one would recognize them. While her parents were in Europe, Cindy started dropping by the house on Memorial Drive. Not only did she help herself to towels and food, she also began trying the downstairs windows to see which one opened with the least amount of noise and effort. On the evening of June 18th, 1 hour after Cindy's parents and Cindy's sons and Maria had all returned from their evening out on the town, David drove Cindy to her parents' house at 10 p.m. so Cindy could get some cash from her mother. But the real purpose of that visit was to unlock the window in the den, so when Cindy and David came back at 3:30 in the morning to kill Cindy's parents, they would have a way to get inside the house. After that short visit to 8901 Memorial Drive, Cindy and David carefully set up an alibi, making sure they were seen at several parties that were too big for anyone to remember exactly when they left, only that they were there. And then, at 3:20 a.m., dressed to kill, David pulled the car they were driving up onto the shoulder of the road directly across from the Campbell's mansion. And when David slid into the Campbell's house through the den window that Cindy had left unlocked, Cindy was right behind him. And it was Cindy who led David up the stairs to her parents' bedroom. And it was Cindy who flipped on the lights just before racing back downstairs, where she dropped that blue glove to wait for David. And for months after the murders, it looked like David and Cindy may have committed the perfect crime. They only had one moment of panic when they realized that Cindy's boys were actually in the Campbell's bedroom when the murders were committed and might be able to ID them. That's when Cindy dragged the children out of the Campbell home on June 23rd and took them to David's apartment, where she and David grilled the two little boys about what they had seen or heard on the night of the murders. Satisfied that the boys could not ID them, Cindy and David simply dropped the boys off at the orphanage. 6 weeks after the murders, Cindy broke up with David and started borrowing large amounts of money drawn against her expected inheritance. And at the same time, the Houston Homicide Division put the Campbell murder investigation in the cold case files. But then, 2 years and 4 months after the murders, and just before Cindy's sisters were ready to settle their parents' estate and distribute the Campbell's inheritance among the 4 daughters, Cindy's older sister, Betty, decided to make one final attempt to see if Cindy had been involved in their parents' murder. And in December of 1984, Betty hired a private detective firm called Clyde Wilson International Investigators to find out who killed James and Virginia. On the evening of Wednesday, December 19th, David West looked up from his drink at the Park Lane bar in Houston and saw just his kind of woman weaving her way towards him. Tall, athletic-looking, and plenty of curves, Teresa Neal, as she later introduced herself, was wearing high-heeled suede boots, black satin pants and jacket, and black eyeliner around her big, vivid blue eyes. 2 weeks later, and David was totally smitten with her. He was fine with the fact that Teresa wanted to keep things between them platonic, at least for now. David had always prided himself on respecting and defending women, which was really what had gotten him mixed up in Cindy's murder plot in the first place. He'd been trying to protect her from her father. But now, the crime he had committed weighed on David, and by January 4th, he had started dropping hints to Teresa that he was keeping a very big secret. And it had to do with an old girlfriend of his, a woman named Cindy Campbell. By mid-February of 1985, David and Teresa had declared their love for one another. But before Teresa could fully trust David and begin the physical relationship he wanted, he had to tell her the details of this secret he was keeping. He had to be totally honest and open with her before she could commit to him. So, on the night of February 20th, after spending the evening together and listening to David talk about Cindy Campbell's crazy tales of abuse, neglect, and incest, Teresa told him it was now or never. As they sat inside her car in the driveway of his house, Teresa's black purse on the console between them, Teresa told David that if he didn't tell her exactly what he and Cindy had done, then Teresa was going to walk out of his life forever. After a long moment of silence, David reached across the space between them, put his fingers under Teresa's chin, and turned her face so he was looking directly into her blue eyes. Then, in a quiet voice, David told Teresa, quote, "I killed both her parents," end quote. Teresa, whose real name was Kim Paris, and whose real job was working as an undercover private detective for the firm that Betty had hired to find her parents' killer, let out a long, astonished breath. In all her time working this case, it had never really occurred to the young private eye that David himself might have executed James and Virginia Campbell. Meanwhile, the tape recorder whirring away silently in the purse that sat between them picked up every word of David's confession. and so did the surveillance team in the police van around the corner, where Kim's partner was listening with 2 police officers. Back at the Houston police station, investigators got the call and the tip they had been waiting for. Thanks to the work done by Clyde Wilson International Investigations and 23-year-old Kim Paris, Houston police could finally close the case on the Campbell murders. Before Kim Paris left David's driveway that night, she and David agreed to meet up together the following night for dinner. And on February 21st, after that dinner, during which David gave up even more details about the murder and Cindy's involvement, Kim told David she needed to stop on their way home at a convenience store so she could buy another pack of cigarettes. When they made that stop, Kim told David to wait in the car, saying she'd be back in just a couple of minutes. As soon as she walked away, an entire team of police officers surrounded the car. When David stumbled out of the front passenger seat, he caught sight of Kim standing on the other side of the store's glass windows. As David was arrested and charged with capital murder, Kim met his eyes and raised the beer can she was now holding in a silent toast. Later that same Thursday, Houston police issued an arrest warrant for Cindy Ray Campbell. And on December 11th, 1985, David West pleaded guilty to the first-degree murders of James and Virginia Campbell. In exchange for that guilty plea, he did not face the death penalty, and he agreed to testify at trial against his one-time girlfriend, Cindy Campbell. David was immediately sentenced to life in prison. In June of 1987, Cindy was also convicted of first-degree murder and was also sentenced to life in prison. David is still incarcerated today at Ramsey Correctional Center in Brazoria County, Texas. As for Cindy, on September 13, 2021, while serving her life sentence at Mountain View Women's Prison in Gatesville, Texas, she died of natural causes. She was 65 years old. In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his co-workers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria, and just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt, as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. Our next story is called One for the Road. Late on the night of Friday, September 18th, 2015, a 45-year-old man named Lattori Barman stumbled down a pitch-black street in a small village in central India. Lattori was stumbling because he was very, very drunk. He and his wife had spent most of the night together out at this local fair, having loads to drink and partying, and then at some point his wife had actually broken off and gone to her parents' house in another village, but Lattori had decided to stay out and keep the fun rolling. And so once she was gone, Lattori had gone to a liquor store and had more to drink there, and then now he had finally decided he had had enough, he was extremely intoxicated, and he just wanted to get back home. And so as Lattori stumbled down this road, he could really only see maybe a foot in front of him. Not only because he was so drunk, but also because the streets in his village did not have lights, and so it was totally dark. However, this wasn't unusual for Lattori. I mean, this is where he lived. He'd walked the street many, many times and knew how to navigate without any lighting. And so he just continued walking along, business as usual. But what did strike him as odd is that, late at night here, as he's making his way home, he thought it was weird that there was a lot of people out on the road. He couldn't really see them because, again, there's no lighting, but he could definitely hear them. Like there was people sort of all over the place, and he also sort of in his intoxicated state saw some lights that, maybe were vehicles sort of moving around. So there was like more activity on this road than usual, but at the same time, like this is a main road and sometimes there's lots of people and cars on it, even late at night. So this didn't really strike him as odd enough to stop and investigate. He just kept on walking towards his house. But as he's walking through with all this commotion all around him, at some point he goes to step, but instead of his foot striking the ground again, there's nothing there. And suddenly he feels himself falling and he smashes into the ground, and now truly it's pitch black. He can't see anything, and he blacks out. The following morning, a group of villagers were walking down the same street that Lattori had been on the night before, and as they were walking, now in broad daylight, they looked up ahead and they noticed something odd right in the middle of the street. And at first they had no idea what it was, and so they walked closer to it to get a better look. And as they walked up on this thing, they instantly understood what it was, and they screamed and ran to tell authorities. It would turn out the reason Lattori was hearing and seeing all these people and, vehicles on the street the night before, which seemed sort of out of place, was because there was actually a construction crew repairing potholes in that road. This road was known for being very dangerous because of these deep potholes. And Lattori, as he was stumbling along, accidentally fell into one of these deep potholes, smashed the ground, and was knocked unconscious. And because this worksite was so chaotic and there was all this, movement and there was bad lighting, none of the crew saw Lattori fall in. And Lattori, even after, coming to inside the hole, was too drunk to get out of the hole. And so at some point that night, the construction crew reached the pothole that Lattori was in. They didn't see him, and they poured molten tar into the hole and then rolled over it with a roller, all with Lattori inside the hole. And so after they were done and moved on to the next pothole, Lattori, in his final moments, tried to kind of pull himself out of this tar, but he only managed to get his hand up and out of the tar. And so the next day, the group of villagers that walked down the road, what did they see? They saw Lattori's hand poking out of the ground. Lattori's body was removed from the street and he was given a proper burial. There were 2 construction workers who were on duty on the night of Lattori's death who were ultimately arrested and charged with culpable homicide. As for Lattori's family, authorities would give them a compensation payment for Lattori's death, but it was only worth approximately $760. The next and final story of today's episode is called Her Face. One evening in September of 1885, a young woman named Mary stepped out of the backseat of a carriage onto a dirt road in rural England. She had traveled 100 miles from London to the countryside because her husband's aunt had invited her to come visit. Standing on the dirt road, Mary looked up at the big country house. Then she grabbed her suitcase and walked up to the front door and knocked. Then, a moment later, the aunt's maid opened the door. She greeted Mary and took her suitcase and brought the suitcase to the guest room, while Mary headed straight down the hallway to her aunt's bedroom. When she got there, Mary gently knocked on the door and then opened it up. And when she looked inside, she saw the aunt lying in bed. And, the aunt looked up and saw Mary and she smiled, but she was very old and very frail, not doing too well physically. And, that's part of the reason Mary was here, to just kind of see her while she still could. But the aunt looked up and saw Mary and recognized her, and so she smiled, and Mary came in and sat down next to her, and for a couple of minutes, the two women just had some small talk. Mary talked about her journey from London to, the countryside where she was now, and, the aunt talked about what she was up to. It was all just kind of, pleasantries. But at some point, the aunt kind of stopped and looked up at Mary, and she had this obvious look of pity on her face. And Mary immediately picked up on it, and she's kind of looking back at the aunt, wondering what's going on here. And then the aunt just says to Mary, "Really, how are you holding up?" And immediately, Mary, when she heard this, she felt this knot in her throat, and she had to fight back tears. She knew exactly what the aunt was talking about. So even though Mary was a young woman, she was already a widow. Her husband had died in an accident about 2 years earlier, and it had sent Mary into this spiraling deep depression. She was still completely grieving the loss of her husband. He had been the love of her life. And, her extended family and her husband's extended family were all well aware of how badly Mary had been doing. And so they had been extending her invitations constantly to come visit and basically just not be alone. That was the reason, really, why her husband's aunt had invited her here, is because she knew Mary likely wasn't doing well. Now, to Mary, this was nice in a way. She felt very comforted by the family members, and it did seem like people genuinely cared about her. But at the same time, she started to get the impression from basically everybody in her and her husband's family that they kind of expected her to, grieve this loss, but ultimately move on. Like, find somebody else, basically. You're young, like, get remarried, start a new life. But to Mary, she just wanted to be like, no, I'm never going to find anyone like my husband. He was the love of my life, and no one will ever match him, ever. Like, I'm done. I probably will never get married again. Like, he was it for me. And so at that moment, Mary really just wanted to end this conversation with her husband's aunt. Like, she didn't want to get into how she was feeling about her husband because it was bad. She felt bad. But instead of saying that to her husband's aunt, she just said, "You know what? I'm okay. I'm just totally exhausted from travel, and I'm going to go to bed." The aunt nodded and told Mary that, we'll have plenty of time to visit tomorrow, so go get some sleep. And so the two women hugged, and then Mary got up, she left the bedroom, headed to the guest room, she found her suitcase, got on some pajamas, and then crawled into bed. But a few hours later, in the middle of the night, Mary suddenly bolted upright in her bed. She was sweating, she was shaking, she was totally disoriented. It took her a few minutes to even remember where she was. But then finally, when she did and she realized she was safe, she realized she had just had this awful, visceral nightmare that she really couldn't even make sense of. In this nightmare, she was looking out at this huge open field. It's nighttime, and there's nothing but this field. But off in the distance, there was this broken down small shed. It was just sitting there conspicuously right in the middle of this field. And even though Mary was terrified of the shed, she felt this overwhelming urge to go to the shed and investigate. And so it's like with every step as she walked through this field closer and closer to the shed, her fear was rising. And then finally, when she got close to the shed, she began to hear what sounded like somebody moaning inside of the structure. And so now she's really scared, but she keeps walking towards the shed, and then she's right outside. She can't see into the shed, but she can hear the moaning, and she sees her hand just come down and fling the door open, almost like she didn't want to, but her body's acting on autopilot. And then she looks into the shed, and there's this figure tucked into the corner, kind of in the shadows, and it's the thing making these moaning sounds. And it turns, and Mary sees it's this woman, this emaciated, destroyed-looking woman, but her face is the same face as Mary's dead husband. And as soon as she saw that, it jolted her awake. And so that's where she was, sitting in her bedroom, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. And so after 15 or 20 minutes of Mary trying and failing to fall back asleep because of this horrible nightmare, Mary finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna go outside, clear my head, go for a walk. I know it's the middle of the night, whatever. I'll bring some brandy along and sip that to calm my nerves and just kind of walk around until I'm calm, and then I'll go back to sleep. So she hopped out of bed, she grabbed her flask of brandy, grabbed her jacket, got her shoes on, and walked out the front door. About 15 minutes later, Mary was walking up a hill with the moonlight casting down on her. She was sipping her brandy as she went and was already beginning to calm down. Now, Mary was used to living in the city, in London, and so being out here in the countryside was so different. It was so beautiful and peaceful and spaced out that she had kind of just begun walking and not stopped. I mean, she originally thought she would just stay on the aunt's property, but already she was well beyond the property lines and was basically just out exploring in the middle of the night, and she was having a nice time. And so up the hill Mary goes. Now, remember, Mary has never been to this area. This is basically an all new place. She has no idea what's over here. And she goes up this hill, she crests the top, and she gets a look at what's up there for the first time. And when she sees what's up there, she freezes. She's looking out at this huge field, basically in all directions. And in the center of this field, maybe a couple hundred yards away, is a single small structure, a broken down wooden shed that looks nearly identical to the shed she had just seen in her nightmare. And as soon as she saw that, she's terrified because she knows it's the same one or it's eerily similar. But worse than that, when she saw it, despite her own fears and trepidations about being up here, she felt herself moving towards the shed. It was like her body went into autopilot the same way it did in her dream. It was like she had to go to the shed, even though everything inside of her logically is saying, don't go. But into the field she goes. She deviates off the path and just starts walking towards the shed. Her heart is beating like mad. And as she's getting closer and closer, she even begins to hear moaning sounds coming from the shed. It's like she's living out the nightmare in real life. She can't make sense of it. She wants to go back the other way, but she can't stop herself. She's just going towards the shed. And then finally she reaches the shed, and now for sure she can hear moaning coming from in this building. And she sees her hand reach down, and she flings open the shed, and she looks in, and sure enough, there is this dark figure tucked in the corner, clearly moaning, like this is her nightmare in real life. But when the person inside the shed turned to look at Mary, it was a woman, but they didn't have her dead husband's face. Instead, it was a woman who practically looked like she was dead or close to death. She obviously needed help. Now, at this point, Mary was kind of relieved. I mean, this whole situation is terrifying, but she was expecting to, somehow see her dead husband's face on this person in the shed. And so when it wasn't, and it was just like a normal person, albeit in a very strange set of circumstances, it was a relief. But now Mary didn't know what to do. It's like she's standing there looking at this woman, having no idea what to do. She doesn't understand how she could have dreamed this and now basically lived it too, like nothing's adding up. But again, it was like her body continued to operate in this autopilot mode. She suddenly had this really intense desire to go into the shed and help this woman. She didn't know who she was. This is a total stranger in the middle of a field in a shed who's moaning and looks terrible. She has no idea what's going on, but in she goes. And she sits down next to this woman who's now kind of eyeing Mary, like, what are you doing in here with me? And Mary says to her, like, hey, what's going on? How'd you get here? What's wrong? Like, what's happening? But the woman, it was clear she wanted to respond to Mary and, tell her what was going on, but, she was too weak. It was like she really was on death's door here. And Mary could clearly see that. Like, she didn't need to be told this woman is in a very bad way here. Now, Mary knew what needed to happen is this woman needs to get to a hospital. But they were nowhere near a hospital, and this woman clearly can't get up and walk. And Mary's thinking, I'm not strong enough to carry this woman to the hospital. Like, what am I gonna do? And, Mary's thinking, maybe if I just run and get help and they can come back here, but she's looking at this woman thinking, I don't know if she'll survive. She's probably gonna die soon. Like, this is gonna happen now. And so Mary, again, sort of in this weird autopilot mode, decides, you know what? I'm gonna stay right here with this woman. She can't even talk. She can't tell me what's going on, but I am gonna be here with her. I'm gonna be present with her. And if she dies, I'll be here to support her. And so Mary just made herself comfortable. She took her jacket off. She put it over this woman. And then she began letting this woman sip from her brandy flask to, maybe kind of ease the pain. And all night, the two women just kind of sat there and laid together. When the sun finally rose the next morning, Mary looked over at the woman and saw she was still alive. And in fact, if anything, she seemed like her condition had maybe improved slightly. She seemed maybe a little bit more comfortable. Maybe that was from all the brandy. Who knows? But the woman seemed like she had stabilized a little bit. Still couldn't talk or really tell Mary anything, but she seemed to be doing a little bit better. And so Mary's thinking, okay, the sun's up now. Now I can run out, get help, and get this woman the care that she needs. But before Mary could even do that, she began hearing a stomping sound somewhere outside of the shed. And she realized it was a horse approaching. And so Mary, she bolts out of the shed and she looks over towards the road, and there's a horse pulling a covered wagon going right by, and Mary screams and yells and says she needs help. And a man pops his head out of the wagon and says what's going on, and Mary runs over to him and explains this weird situation, how there's this strange woman over here and she's clearly dying, she needs our help. And the man agreed to help. And so he went with Mary to the shed, he picked the woman up, he put her inside of his wagon, and then the three of them together in this wagon drove to Mary's husband's aunt's house. When they got there, the man carried the strange woman inside of the aunt's house, and then Mary told the aunt's maid to go call for the town doctor, and so she said she would. And so at this point, Mary was actually completely relieved. This was kind of a wild, very unexpected night. She doesn't even know who this woman is, but she's definitely happy that she's getting, some level of care here. But Mary sort of felt like her role in this was kind of diminished now. She's gotten the woman here and she's feeling so tired and weak from being up all night. And so Mary decided she would just take a nap. She had been up all night with this woman. She was exhausted. So into her bedroom she went, she climbed into bed, and as she's laying there, she realized she wasn't just tired, she actually felt kind of sick, like ill. And over the next few hours, as she kind of tossed and turned in her bed, not really able to sleep, she would develop this horrible fever. And this fever would just get worse and worse and worse, and Mary would become bedridden, dealing with this mystery illness for weeks, just drifting in and out of consciousness the whole time. It was October by the time Mary's fever finally broke. And on the day that it did, when Mary opened her eyes in this bed, she was clear-headed for the first time. Really, it had been a very rough stretch of a few weeks. And so she's looking around the room, kind of taking stock of her environment, and she sees there's this strange person sitting in a chair in the corner. And her immediate reaction is, oh, this must be like a nurse or a doctor or somebody here that's kind of overseeing me. Mary was aware she had been very sick for several weeks and there were people in and out of the room, but she looked back at this person and realized she actually knew who it was. It was the woman she had rescued from the shed on the night she got sick. It was that woman. But now she wasn't sickly and dying. The woman looked completely healthy and happy, and she was smiling ear to ear at Mary. Like, this didn't make any sense. Like, what's going on here? And also, Mary just couldn't help but think, like, wait a minute, why is this woman still here? It has been weeks since I rescued her from the shed. Why is she still here? Like, nothing's adding up. But before Mary could ask any questions, this woman, who clearly was super excited to see that Mary was now fully awake and attentive, this woman just starts talking a mile a minute. Like she had been waiting to dump all this information on Mary as soon as she was well. Like clearly this woman has been waiting diligently for her chance to tell her story. And the story that she dumped on Mary at her first chance, like this day, was incredible. The woman told her that a couple of years earlier, she had boarded this ship in England that was bound for Brazil. But about 5 days into their journey, while they're out on the open sea, the ship caught fire. This horrible fire, everyone's trying to evacuate, and this woman said she was in her bedroom, asleep. She didn't even know what was happening. And while she's laying there and the ship is catching fire and beginning to sink, this stranger comes barreling into the room, literally wakes her up, scoops her up, and takes her to the top deck and gets her into a lifeboat right as the ship sinks. I mean, this stranger completely saved this woman's life. And so this woman, the stranger who had saved her, and a handful of other lucky people who had made it onto this lifeboat just began rowing in a single direction, hoping they'd find land. And luckily they did. They found this deserted island. And so they landed there, and for a year, this woman and the stranger and those few people subsisted on this island, barely clinging to life, praying for rescue. And amazingly, after a year of being shipwrecked, they flagged down a ship that did rescue them and brought them to England. However, when they actually got to England, things weren't that good. The stranger who had saved this woman had basically lost his mind from living on this island, not expecting to be rescued. Even though they got rescued, it was like he wasn't coherent anymore. He had lost it. Not to mention he was really ill from the way they were living on this island, scavenging things that weren't necessarily edible, but just to survive, they were eating whatever they could. I mean, it was a very rough lifestyle.
And this man, he just hadn't really handled it well. And so he got thrown in a hospital and placed in a particular ward for people that were mentally unwell, and he was basically forgotten about. However, the woman would tell Mary that, when this happened, she felt awful because she felt like this stranger had saved her life and she kind of owed him a debt. And so she decided it would be her mission to find the stranger's family and let them know where he was. And so the woman said she did some research and she figured out where one of his relatives lived. It was really far away on the other side of England. And so she spent all her money, using every vehicle she possibly could, every ride she could take, getting as close to this location as she possibly could. And then when she ran out of money, she just kept on walking towards this destination. And she kept going until she literally ran out of food and water, but she wasn't quite there yet. She knew she was getting close, and she's just walking and she's basically falling apart, so hell-bent on finding this family member for this stranger, but she can't quite make it. She can't quite get to the family member's house. And that's when she finds this shed out in the middle of the field where she just collapses, thinking, okay, this is where I'm gonna die. And so back in the guest room, Mary is listening to this woman tell this unbelievable story, and at some point the woman just kind of stops when she gets to the shed scene. And Mary's looking at her like, I don't really understand where you're going with this. I don't understand why you're here telling me this. And the woman, she just starts to laugh, like this joyous laughter, just nonstop laughter. And then she goes, don't you get it? And then seconds later, Mary hears footsteps, and a man walks into the bedroom, and it's Mary's husband. He was the stranger who rescued that woman. He didn't die in an accident 2 years ago like they thought. He was in a shipwreck, but he survived. He was the man who got thrown in the hospital and forgotten about. And it was this woman who was making the journey to his aunt's house to tell her that he was still alive. And it was only because Mary had that totally bizarre nightmare that sort of led her to that shed that she found this woman who would have died in that shed and never quite gotten to the aunt's house, and so never could have told the family, never could have told Mary that her husband's still alive. It was because of that dream that fate aligned, and now her husband was back. Mary and her husband's story wound up being published in newspapers all over the world. I mean, people really could not get enough of this story. But despite how far-reaching this story became, nobody was ever able to come up with a logical explanation for how so many coincidences and this crazy dream Mary had, how it all came together to reunite Mary and her husband. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.